Well, everybody, thanks for joining us and welcome to the webinar, Implicit Biases 101, Recognizing and Examining Them in the Conservation Workplace. I'm Dave Reynolds. I'm the president of the George Wright Society, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Our speaker today is Dr. Mariela Fernandez of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Fernandez will explain what implicit biases are, how they're formed, and how they may impact behavior. She'll share studies that showcase implicit bias scenarios that are common in our conservation workplace. So if you have questions, we ask that you type them into the Zoom chat function, and they'll be answered at the end of this talk. This event is part of the George Wright Society's Socio-Environmental Justice webinar series, which seeks to advance justice, diversity, and equity and inclusion in the conservation field. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Society, we're an international organization that champions stewardship of parks, protected areas, and cultural sites by connecting people, places, and knowledge and ideas. Dr. Fernandez is a board member of the George Wright Society. So, Dr. Fernandez, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This is one of my favorite presentations to give, so I'm very happy to share it with you. So what I had planned today, we are going to talk about 5 different questions. So the questions are, what are implicit biases? Why are implicit biases important to the conservation workplace? What do we currently know about implicit biases? We are going to do a fun activity, so you'll get to learn more about what your implicit biases are. And then finally, time permitting, we'll talk a little bit more about what strategies have been used to address implicit biases. So I do want to start off with the definition of implicit biases. So according to the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, implicit biases refers to the attitudes and stereotypes that impact us at an unconscious level. So these are very different than explicit biases. So for example, an explicit bias might be a manager refusing to promote a young person because he or she believes that young people would not make good leaders. Right? So that might be explicit. The manager knows that he or she believes this and it's impacting their behavior, not hidden at all. They are very conscious of that. An unconscious implicit bias might be more so a manager who says young people deserve to be in leadership positions. Yet there's very subtle behavior that shows otherwise. Right, so maybe the manager isn't promoting as much, but doesn't even realize it, or maybe isn't as friendly to the young folks as he or she believes to be. So it's really this very ingrained attitudes and stereotypes that we carry that we don't even know that we have. And I'll give you another example. Whoops. They hide the little arrows on me, so give me a moment. Okay, so I just flashed a word on the screen, park manager. So by now, most of you have already had an image pop into your brain. So for some of you, that image might have been of a man. For others, it might have been of a white man. Right? There might be some of you, maybe a minority, who actually are imagining someone else, whether that be a woman or maybe a person of color. But with the implicit biases, there's this whole idea that our brain is constantly making these associations, and they happen within a split second. We don't even realize that we're doing it. And it's just the way that our brain kind of makes sense of the complex world around us. And, you know, for the most part, it could be okay, except sometimes these associations or shortcuts are incorrect. So for example, the park manager, if you thought of the white man, which I will admit I did, Not all park managers are men, not all of them are white, yet our brain, for some of us, in that split second, that's the image that we came up with. So it's these automatic associations that sometimes become problematic because it might manifest in our behavior, which we'll talk a little bit more in a few slides. But again, I'd like to thank the George Wright Society for letting me come here, because I think this is important for a lot of the conservation organizations, whether we work in the nonprofit sector or for the government. I know there has been growing efforts for conservation organizations to really reflect the diversity of those living in our countries. So I know there's a couple of Canadians here and some folks who live in the US. So whether it's in the US or Canada, I believe most of the conservation organizations are struggling with this. And I will say, to me, there are two components of this. There's the recruitment and the retention, right? So there might be some implicit biases that are hurting us in the recruitment of a diverse staff. But also, once we get these staff in place, there might be some biases that are impact whether they choose to stay within our organizations or not. As far as those working with public lands, of course, there have been growing efforts as well to make sure that we are serving a diverse public, just because they have equal right to the land as everyone else. So if you're one of these, I think this presentation will definitely be of help. But I do want to put a disclaimer. So right now, for the next couple of slides, we will talk about what we know about implicit biases. And even though this research has been done for about, a decade or more, there have not really been any studies done in the conservation field, nor in the leisure field or the park and recreation field. So it's very limited. So most of the examples are found at the university level or in public health. So most of the studies are done there. So I picked out some examples that I think could transcend the field, and we could definitely use them, to understand the conservation workplace, but also to improve how we operate in these spaces. So I'll try and make the connections as best I can, but I think some of them will be very clear. Okay, so again, I kind of mentioned the importance of recruitment and retention. And I think some of you are aware of the research that talks about when managers receive resumes, if the resume has an ethnic name. So a pair of researchers use the example of like Jamal. So if it has an ethnic name, sometimes managers see that as being a less competent employee. So they disregard that resume. I did look a little bit more into that. And what I didn't realize is that with applicants with white sounding names, they received about 50% more callbacks than those individuals with an ethnic sounding name. And as far as closing that gap, Black applicants had to have about 8 additional years of experience to get the callback at the same rate as whites. So definitely not fair, one would say. If we bring candidates also for an interview, for example, individuals with accents were perceived as less competent. This is another example, same set of researchers. They kind of use the example of names. So again, think about the example of park manager, right? So as soon as I said that, you had a picture that popped into your mind. So same thing when the researchers asked about Charles and Catherine, that immediate reaction was to associate these names with things like they're knowledgeable, they're perceptive, they're resourceful. But when flashing participants with other names like Carlos and Juanita, participants didn't feel the same. So they described these people named Carlos and Juanita as individuals who might have been ignorant or dull or probably just not competent. So as we can see, that immediate association can definitely impact us in who we bring into our workplaces. And again, I said that most of the studies take place in public health or university settings. In one study, faculty had to rate applicants, and it was for a position as lab manager. And faculty still rated women as less competent and less hireable. And I know as a faculty member myself, sometimes individuals say, well, you're the ones who have most access to an education, and the more educated you are, the less biased you're supposed to be. But with the idea of implicit bias, it really is everyone who grew up under a system, right, that has groups that are oppressed or stereotyped. So we're all impacted by implicit biases. So it doesn't matter if we're doctors in public health, if we're faculty in academia, right? All individuals are impacted. In fact, I have done this presentation numerous times over the years, and I always take the implicit test with y'all, as you will be asked to do so. And I continue to have biases every time I do that. And I'm also very active in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. But again, same thing. I'm also a victim to greater society, and I have biases which I might not even realize I have. With women, we've also noticed that in the workplace, they do tend to receive more praise, but fewer resources, right? And I will say, as someone who has had that happen, we definitely notice. And another thing that, again, is more subtle is when people describe women workers, they do so in very different language, right? So women might be described more as hardworking versus men who might be described as brilliant, right? And thinking about the word brilliant, right? I was thinking about my biases, and brilliant to me right away popped an image of a male scientist, right? So for people reading those letters of recommendations, these words kind of trigger their own images, right? They have their own associations. And what we're noticing is a bias in favor of men, which there is a very neat calculator that is now available. So I'll definitely bring that up to your attention at the end of the presentation when I talk about the strategies used to tackle implicit biases. And now this is one of the more recent studies. So a group of researchers did a study where men had greater implicit gender stereotypes. And when men had these stereotypes, they were less likely to have close social ties with female coworkers, meaning that they would prefer to kind of work with their male coworkers, right? And when women mostly just worked with women only, they were reporting like they didn't belong in the workplace. So they felt more isolated, right? So in order for them to feel included, to feel welcome at their job place of employment, they had to work with everyone in the organization and not just a group of coworkers. Another study that has been important for women also, this was done at the university level, but in a classroom, what researchers noticed is that female students tended to be interrupted more while speaking. And I pulled this one because I think about our staff meetings, right? Or just any team meeting that happens. You know, how many times are your women staff members interrupted versus your men? Now, when I do this presentation, I'm always remind my audience that this isn't just about negative behavior, right? So this isn't just about not giving people a job because they have an ethnic name or passing them up for a promotion. implicit biases also impacts our micro behavior, and it also impacts our warm behavior. So this is about more subtle things. So whenever we feel very comfortable with someone, we smile more or we give more eye contact. So when you have implicit biases against a certain group of people, what happens is that you might not be as warm and friendly with them, right? So there was this really neat research study that they did. It was in real estate, and it was white families and Black families who had to contact a real estate agent through email, and they had the same questions that they asked the agent. Well, what happened is that the agent responded to the questions to both families, right? So the families at the end of the day got the responses that they were looking for. However, what the researcher noticed was that for white families, the agents were just a little bit more friendly, right? So they said more hello. They provided more additional feedback and additional kind of responses, even though they weren't solicited, but they just found that, hey, maybe this family needed that information and I think they should have it. So with the Black families, they didn't go that extra step. So when we think about visitors to parks, for example, or just the people who come in and out of our organization, it's like, are we saying hello to everyone? Are we equally as warm with everyone? If we're at a conference and we enter a room, for example, and we don't know anyone, who are we gravitating toward, right? So sometimes this behavior is so subtle that you don't even notice it until someone points it out. So this, I would say, is a fun part of the presentation. So what you are going to do is that now it's time to examine your implicit biases. Now, I will say there's a website where you can monitor your own. It's not a perfect system, but I always tell the students and other audiences that I've talked to, this is a very good way to kind of start the conversation. So Dave Harmon, if you can copy and paste the link in the chat, that'd be appreciated. And everyone who's here, there is a website that you can click on in your chat. You're going to go to the website, you're going to scroll all the way down, and you are going to click on I wish to proceed. I will say you can do this on your computer. You can also do this on your smartphone if you have one. For our purposes, we ask that you do the race one, but I know that this doesn't really transcend maybe the US context. So really at the end of the day, you can take whichever one you want. We will ask what you got on the race implicit bias test. So some of you, if you take the race one, that'd be great, but just kind of have fun with it. It's a short test. It's on the computer. And let's see if Dave, if you put it on the chat.
Should be there, Mariela, I think.
I cannot see the chat, but if it's there, I'll give everyone a quick second to go to the website. Again, scroll down to I wish to proceed and go ahead and select the race test. And the Daves, I actually can't see the chat and I can't see people's faces either. So if you get a sense of when people are wrapping up, just let me know so I can move on to the next slide.
Will do, Mariela. Yeah, I put the link to the test in the chat, and so you could probably move on. I don't know how long it takes to take the test because I'm not doing it. I'm going to stay on the site here, but
Yeah, I'm working on it. The link is there, so
Okay.
I'm not quite done with it, but I'm a little slow.
No, it takes a while.
Did you want me to, Mariela? Do you want me to launch the polls at this point, or wait until everyone wait till further?
Yeah, we can wait till they're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
While we're waiting, Mariela, there's a couple of messages that have come in from folks. One notes that it's mostly asking for demographic info, and another person said that I could not complete the race test. It would have been helpful to have had no opinion or something. I assume is an option. The test required you to have an opinion. What if you don't? So just a comment there on the test.
Yeah, if you don't, it should have it would have taken you just as long for both groups, so you would have eventually gotten a neutral response at the end. But I can definitely mention that when people finish up.
And another of our attendees says, I'm putting neither agree or disagree. So,
Yeah, that's what I was doing in place of no opinion.
okay.
So once you start wrapping up, I think it'd be helpful if in the chat you start, saying that you're done to let us know that you're done. That would definitely be helpful.
Mariela, one of the questions is if your occupation is not listed, what do you put in for the last question?
I thought at the bottom, if you scroll down all the way to the bottom, is there an other?
The attendee said that she didn't see an other option at the bottom, but I don't know.
And I think you can skip those. And as folks wrap up, what you are looking for is a statement that tells you that you have a preference for one group or the other, or you might not even have a preference for either or. So there should be a statement at the top of the page telling you what you got, but you're really looking for just the one sentence that tells you what your preference is. Okay, are people wrapped up?
I don't have everybody listed. I'm not getting that note from people yet.
Okay,
Yeah, I don't see any notes. There's some people who are still,
Yeah, they're still working on it.
working. Yep. Yeah, there's several people who've had comments on the content or the structure of the quiz itself, which is interesting feedback. One person says, why do they conflate bad with Black people? This quiz seems terribly biased itself. I don't get this. So some people are questioning the structure of the quiz, which is interesting.
yeah, I can definitely talk about that.
We're getting some people who are saying they're done now, Mariela. So why don't you give it maybe another minute or so and then probably go ahead.
Yeah. And I'll ask you in a moment, Dave, if you can open up the poll. The first one to see what they got.
Would you like me to launch it now or do you want to wait a minute?
Yeah, we can wait, 30 more seconds?
Yeah, that'll be good.
Yeah, well, Dave, are you counting how many people have finished versus how many people have signed up for the seminar?
Yeah, no, it's a small percentage have indicated they were they're finished. So some people are still working.
Do you want a larger number to finish before you launch the poll?
Well, we've got about, it looks like well, we have 48 attendees, so it's a really good turnout. And right now it looks like 7 or 8 people have indicated they're done, but maybe not everybody is sharing that with us. I'm not sure. I'm just looking at the time because it's 2:28 on my time. I just want to make sure we don't run too long. So
Yeah, we'll be fine.
okay.
Well, I guess while we wait also, I can definitely provide a little bit more context on the test. I think there are definitely some critiques of it, right? For research-wise, people have commented that you have to take it more than one time for it to be more accurate. Others do wonder if it's accurate at all, because again, implicit biases are supposed to be very, very deep-rooted. So is it possible to really get at them? As far as the question about the associations and why is one bad versus the other, this kind of goes back to the comments about implicit biases. Sometimes it's about that association that happens in a second, right? So in North America, at least here in the US, the way that the darker skinned individuals have been portrayed in the media has usually been as they are bad or they are criminal, right? So the idea the researchers did was kind of label whether they were good or bad. And what was supposed to happen is, if you felt uncomfortable and you took equally as long for the European Americans as you did for African Americans to rate either group as bad, So if you took equally as long, you were to get a response that said you had no preference for the groups. If it was easier to label one group as bad over the other, that's kind of getting at that automatic feeling that you may feel when flashed on those images. So for some folks, it becomes a little bit easier to regard the dark skin or lighter skin individuals in these categories. And therefore the test, spits out whether you have a slight preference, a moderate preference, or a strong preference. I do have a feeling that some people right away, depending on their answer, will ask, well, does this mean I'm a racist? Right? That is not the point of the test. This point is not to determine whether you are or are not. I think the construct of racism, we can definitely spend another whole day talking about that. But this is more about getting into these deep-rooted attitudes or stereotypes that you might not even know that you had. So what I tell my audiences is that I really like this as a way to start the conversation or to start the self-reflection. So Dave is going to put up a poll. We're kind of curious about what you got. This is anonymous, so you don't have to worry that you are going to, single yourself out. So if you feel comfortable, wanted to know a little bit more about what was your score, and also were you surprised with your score? I think doing this, I've seen the range of reactions to what the scores have been, from surprise to happy that they got a neutral. So we're just curious to see what you got and whether you were surprised.
Are you able to view the poll results, Mariela? Can you see those at all?
No, I just see the poll.
Okay.
I think on your end, you're supposed to close the poll and it tells you what the answers are.
Okay. Well, it's been up for about 1 minute and 15 seconds, and 26 of our 47 participants have responded. So you just let me know when you want to end the poll.
Yeah, we can end it now. Some people don't feel comfortable.
Okay. And I'll click share results. So I don't know if people can see this or not.
Yeah, so it seems the majority of the responses, either you had a slight or strong preference for European Americans. That is actually where I usually fall. Then other folks, you were not surprised. Unfortunately, we have a time limit. There is another part of my presentation that we sometimes discuss is like, well, if we did have a biases, where are they coming from? And we usually look at things like our family, our friends, the media, and so forth. So some people are very surprised by the answers, some were not. Some of my audiences really like when they're in the no preference. So again, just a tool that has been made to kind of test implicit biases. What we won't have time to do as a group, but I definitely want you to kind of consider the question after the presentation, is how might your biases be manifesting in your behavior or attitude, right? And again, this might take you a while to answer because these are biases that we're not aware of. And the final question is, what can you do to address your biases, which is the final portion of this presentation. Okay, let me go back to my arrows to click forward. Okay. It is not clicking forward. Okay, there we go. Now 2 forward. Okay, so the research has tried to look at how to reduce biases. So the first one I'm going to talk about is meditation. And the one that has really been tested is the loving kindness meditation. And there are numerous videos of this on YouTube that you can find. You can probably find a voice that you feel the most comfortable with. And because of time, I won't play it, but really there are 4 sentences in this meditation that are said over and over and over again, while also kind of doing some deep breathing exercises. And the 4 sentences that you repeat over and over again is, may I be happy? May I be healthy? May I be safe? May I live with ease? So you meditate using that mantra, and researchers think that that decreases your psychological stress, and therefore it impacts your biases and serves to reduce them. Another neat thing that I've seen in the research is also the use of video games. So, for example, we talked about the role of men and women and the biases there. So let's say, for example, me as a woman has bias against men. Well, if I were to play a video game, I might create an avatar, and the avatar would be a man. Right? So the idea is that you play with the avatar. Of course, I think you would probably want to win. So your avatar would be doing pretty well because you're playing it and you want to enjoy the game. So the more you kind of play the game with your avatar that looks nothing like you, it has kind of shown to decrease your implicit biases. So there might be people kind of creating some sympathy and connection with their avatar, which impacts some, real life behavior. Another thing that is recommended is also exposing yourself to counter stereotype images, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be in person. If you do it in person, you can definitely point things out, but even in TV and the media, right? Like the photo down here, when I think about gym goers, right? I automatically get an image of who gym folks are. And so my image maybe doesn't include women who wear a headscarf, right? So if you produce some more images that are counter the stereotype, then you start seeing a more range of people in your view. And also, of course, spending time with others and learning more about them as people. So researchers kind of mentioned that the more you see a person as an individual and not their group member, that you are more likely to decrease your stereotypes of them. So for example, I identify as Latina. So for right now, you might be describing me, right, in terms that are used for the Latino group. But the more that you get to know me, then people might start seeing me more as Mariela instead of just the Latino woman. And what does this mean for hiring, right? So if you remember back, we kind of talked about the ethnic names and the people with accents and the biases that kind of created in managers doing the hiring. I will say that standardizing the process and making it fair and transparent is always a recommendation. Definitely, you have to set your criteria of what you're looking for and what competence looks like. But also when you're getting to know your individuals, when you're interviewing them, making sure that you're asking the same questions across the board. So recently, I'm on a search committee here at my organization, and we did the first interview. The conversation just flowed very freely, and someone on our search committee asked a couple extra questions. So at the end of that session, someone on our committee said, I really enjoyed the conversation, but I noticed that 2 extra questions were inserted. And because of those questions that were inserted, we're now going to have a little bit more information about this person. And that might create a favorable bias toward them, right? Because we know more about them, so we grow to like them a little bit more. And I know we already have our set questions, but let's make it fair, and let's make sure we ask those extra 2 questions to everyone, which we did. It was a very easy fix. But also that kind of reiterates the point of having a representative, right? Either a representative or just an advocate on our search committees, right? To kind of curtail some of that bias that could occur. And I also mentioned about women and the way that they are described is sometimes very different than how men are described. Well, there is a website now that if you write, for example, a letter of recommendation, you can copy and paste your letter into this calculator. And the calculator kind of puts out and tells you how many feminine words were used versus your masculine words. So this was, it's something that I think is really helpful, and I definitely do it every time I write students recommendation letters, because again, you might not be aware of the biases that you have. So it's always great to have that extra step. Other things that might be a little bit more difficult to do is kind of warm behavior, right? And making sure that you do that across the board. And finally, people within your organization. Are there people that you don't know very well, right? Asking them for lunch or coffee would be a good idea. For some of the men, you might not feel as comfortable, right? Reaching out to a female coworker. I will say this does not have to be all one-on-one. If it's better to do it in a group, definitely do it as a group. But there have been studies that kind of talk about the men clubs, right? So the conversation that happens between men at the water cooler or in the restrooms or at sporting events in cases that they hang out on the weekend with themselves, right? And so when this happens, what researchers have noticed is that men tend to give each other leadership positions, right? So it's kind of a natural thing. And some of the critiques is like, well, women didn't have the opportunity to be in those spaces, right? They can't follow you into the restroom. And, as far as joining to a sporting event, they might have childcare duties or household duties. So making it very difficult for them to attend. So, in that case, women were losing out on leadership positions. So again, being aware of that and making sure that you're kind of evening out the playing field will definitely go a long way. And finally, my last question to you, this is more rhetorical, is which strategies would you implement? It's not a one size fits all. You might feel more comfortable with one strategy over another. So after you leave this presentation, I definitely want you to think about what strategies would work best for you and how your implicit biases might be affecting your behavior or attitudes. And that is the end of my presentation. So I'll definitely be taking questions now.
Thank you, Mariela. That was great. So please write any questions that you have into the chat, and we will take them right up until about 5 minutes to 2. We have a couple questions right now that is a kind of a summary of some of the comments that we've received already. The first one is about the test itself. We've received some real-time criticisms about the implicit bias evaluation from our attendees. These suggest that measuring implicit biases is complicated. Given that, do you have specific suggestions for people working in the conservation workplace about ways they can measure implicit bias in their particular workplace?
Yeah, and I think it's definitely difficult, which I think is why the studies haven't caught up. If you don't feel comfortable using the AIT, I think that's definitely understandable. I think it's definitely a good way to start the conversation, knowing full well that there might be some caveats. I definitely recommend, if this one made you uncomfortable and you didn't see it as useful, I definitely do suggest that you look at the other ones. There might be some other ones that you feel more comfortable with. Some of the other ones, for example, the one on gender, it's whether you associate women with having a career or with staying at home. So there's definitely more than just that one. So I apologize if this wasn't, if it made you uncomfortable. But definitely, as far as measuring it, I don't have a good answer, unfortunately. So there have been experiments that have been done. So for example, the example I use with the real estate agents, where we do kind of an email to different workers and see how they respond, and we look at their emails afterwards. I know that can be kind of cumbersome at a workplace. I would say that probably if I were a manager, I would be looking more at procedures, right? So if I notice that there's clicks, maybe my women are not feeling as comfortable, and maybe they're mentioning things like there's a boys club. Then as a manager, I would probably start seeing if I can create opportunities for relationships to kind of create organically through things like team building exercises. Things like recommendation letter, right? It's going to be very easy to implement a policy of, hey, y'all, every time you write a recommendation letter, run it through the calculator just to see what you get. So I think some of the behaviors that might change might be subtle, like the calculator, and others, I think you definitely need the manager buy-in, and you need someone to take the reins and do things like team building activities or troubleshooting these things when they arise.
Thank you. Another question, you also mentioned the advantage of having a diversity-aware advocate involved in hiring decisions. Are you aware of any strategies that people in the parks community can use to identify such advocates?
No, I've seen two different ways, at least in my organization. So sometimes it's an individual, well, I guess three ways. Sometimes it's an individual who volunteers, so they have the knowledge, they take on that role, which I think that would not be ideal, right? Because what if people don't volunteer? The second option that I've seen is people designate someone like, hey, this is really an issue. We need someone to take the lead on this. I want you to do it. So then that individual kind of takes the lead and does some of this research and makes sure, like my coworker, who makes sure like that we're asking the same questions across the board and so forth. The third option that I've seen is actually from HR. The HR themselves has taken the lead because they believe that the organization should be diverse and that there should be policies coming from up above. So in some organizations, the HR is the one who designates a representative to help on these search committees.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And we have another one related to the survey, where there was a prompt that said selfish, choose bad black or good white. What kind of choice is that? And that's where the person just quit the survey. It didn't seem even fair to ask. Can you comment on the structure of the survey?
Yeah, and unfortunately, time permitting, I wasn't able to talk about where our biases come from. So there are a lot of media examples, for example, where it might be, there was one picture I shared with Katrina. So after the hurricane happened here in the US, which was a pretty tragic event, there were individuals kind of getting supplies as needed because there's water everywhere. They have no food, they have no supplies. So we did notice a difference in the way that the media was reporting. So for the individuals who had a lighter skin tone, they were really talked about like, oh, the victims found food and they, are doing everything, that they need to survive. For our individuals who were more dark-skinned, they were kind of talked about like, look at these individuals looting and creating crimes while there's, this tragic event that has occurred. And so I think it would have probably made more sense in that context. So this was not I know it probably was not a good look, but contextualizing it into the way that the media and greater society sometimes talks about these groups, it is definitely relevant. So I think that would have definitely helped to show you some of those photos of how these groups are treated and talked about in greater society.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. So I'll give the participants 1 minute. I do want to say, though, that if participants have additional questions that they can answer later, you can always write to Mariela. You see her email on the website right here. We've recorded this webinar also, and we'll post it on the George Wright Society website for those who weren't able to attend today. So if any of your colleagues have people who missed it and would like to have seen it, please do so. I do have another question that came up. Let's see. I am intrigued by the first tool the presenter highlighted for countering our implicit biases, happy mediation. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I don't have as much more information. So yeah, that is there. You will find tons of meditation videos online. So again, that is one of the ones that has been talked about the most. So let me go back. I think part of it, when I've done it with audiences, we've kind of talked about like, what is it about that type of meditation that might lend itself to decreasing biases? And I think first of all, it's you're more relaxed, right? So I think when you're more relaxed, it also lets you kind of really evaluate situations. So remember, with the implicit biases, the things that we do happen fast. So with meditation, one of the ideas is that we really get to slow down and evaluate things pretty clearly. The other thing I would say about the meditation, there have been newer studies where they look at other types of meditation and it seems to be working. But because those are fewer, I wanted to make sure I recommend what is being used the most. So if you were to start somewhere, I would definitely start off with the loving kindness meditation. When I talk to my audiences, the other thing that we talk about is like, you know, may I be happy? May I be healthy? May I be safe? May I live with ease? I think there is, right, that message of self-care and kindness and self-love. So I think part of it also is that has to kind of transfer to others. So again, when I do these presentations, that is one of the ones that I have found useful and is talked about in the research more. There are tons of these videos. Some are 17 minutes, 20 minutes. I just picked out the 5-minute one, but you can definitely, we can send you this link and you can definitely find a whole lot more online.
Okay, and I have one more quick question, and this will have to be the last one. I thank you, Mariela, and everyone. I didn't feel uncomfortable with the test. I just kind of felt left out because I couldn't find an answer that I thought best represented my honest answer. That said, I know I have a lot of implicit biases, and perhaps not just the ones that are on the test. This is a good reminder. I need to work on those. So it's more of a comment, I think, than
okay.
anything else.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some of them that I think I definitely have a hard time with, and I definitely get them wrong. So yeah, it's totally fine.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody who've joined this event, and I wanted to remind you that webinars such as these are supported by George Roy Society members and through donations from people like you who can attend our webinars. You can visit our website by going to https://georgewrightsociety.org. And while you're there, you can learn more about the organization's programs and how it may benefit the work that you're doing. Thanks for your participation and for your support. And with that, I guess we will sign off. I really appreciate you attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. And thank you again, Mariela.